Hi everybody. Today we are looking at evaluating arguments within logic. Now what we're going to be covering this lecture is the structure of how arguments should be written, the structure that you should be expecting when experiencing an argument, also the content aspect within that structure. And then lastly, we are going to just do a few exercises and make sure that we're kind of just gaining practice at seeing arguments. The best way to really get good at analyzing arguments is just seeing lots of them and practicing them. So when we're looking at arguments and evaluating them, specifically deductive arguments, specifically, these arguments can go wrong in two ways. Either the premises don't support the conclusion. So if you remember standard form arguments, with the conclusion being at the bottom and then the premises being the bullets above that. So either the premises do not support the conclusion or the premises are false for some reason. These are the only two ways arguments can go wrong. Now, this is important to know because when you experience an argument, you are looking for the structure of that argument. You are seeing whether or not the premises support the conclusion. And then you are trying to determine whether or not, in fact, the premises are all true. If either of these are off, then the argument is not going to be a good one. A good argument requires good structure and it requires true premises and a true conclusion. So when we look at an argument, these are the things that we want to look for. So looking at this argument right now, I want to ask, what's wrong with it? If I'm making the claim that James must have walked out the door to this class, and my reasons for believing that he walked out the door to this class is that if James walks out the door to this class, then he will be outside, and James is outside, I have two options. Either these two premises in black do not support the conclusion in red, or one of the two propositions in black are false, if not both. So when we look at this, we need to come to the conclusion that it is the premises not supporting the conclusion. So this argument is wrong because the premises do not entail the conclusion. I can believe that if James walks out the door to this class, then he will be outside. And I can also believe that James is outside right now. However, I can deny the conclusion that James must have walked out the door to this class because maybe James had been outside the whole time. Or perhaps maybe James jumped through the window or crawled through the ventilation system. Either way, I can accept the premises and deny the conclusion. And if I can accept the premises and deny the conclusion, then my premises must not support the conclusion. A good argument would have one believe the premises, and therefore the conclusion would be entailed so that I would have to accept the conclusion. Now, what about this one? What's wrong with this argument? Is it the structure or the content? Donald Trump is a highly popular president. If the president is highly popular, he is likely to be a good leader. Therefore, Trump is likely to be a good leader. Here, the premises do entail the conclusion. We have an argument here with good structure. The problem, however, is that the second premise is false. Just because a president is popular doesn't mean the president is likely to be a good leader. These really don't have anything to do with one another. And so, while my premises may lead me to believe my conclusion, I don't trust the premises because premise 2 is false. So here, our argument is problematic because of its content. Which brings me to the first criteria of a good argument, and that is its structure. And assuming an argument has good structure, it is said to be a valid argument. So when we're checking an argument for validity, we're checking to determine whether or not the premises lead to the conclusion. And more than just lead to the conclusion, they infer the conclusion, which means the conclusion cannot be denied if the premises are true. So when you're checking for the validity of an argument, you want to ask yourself, if the premises are true, and pretend that they're true, do I have to believe the conclusion? Or is there a way that I can deny the conclusion? If you can deny the conclusion, even though you've accepted the premises, then the argument is not valid and the structure is bad. If you were forced to accept the conclusion while accepting the premises, then the argument is valid and the structure is good. So looking at this argument, giving just a little background information, David Beckham is an English soccer player, and he is married to, I believe, Posh Spice, one of the Spice Girls. So with that information, all soccer players are married to pop stars. David Beckham is married to a pop star, therefore David Beckham is a soccer player. Ask yourself whether or not this argument is valid. This argument is not valid. And the reason it's not valid is because the premises do not guarantee the conclusion. Even though the conclusion is a true statement, it is still not guaranteed by the premises. For instance, I may believe that all soccer players are married to pop stars, but maybe the David Beckham we're talking about in this second sentence is not David Beckham the soccer player, but is David Beckham the trash collector. And David Beckham the trash collector happens to be married to a pop star. If that's the case, then it's not necessarily certain that David Beckham, the David Beckham that we're talking about, the trash collector, is a soccer player. So here I've accepted the two premises as being true, which they both are true, but I've denied the conclusion. And if I'm able to deny the conclusion, my argument is not valid. The premises do not support the conclusion. The premises may point to something different, but they do not point to the idea that David Beckham is in fact a soccer player. If, however, the first premise were to say all people married to pop stars are soccer players and David Beckham is married to a pop star, then our argument would be valid. But because all soccer players are married to pop stars is different than the statement all people married to pop stars are soccer players, we have an invalid argument here. What about this one? Every man married to a former Spice Girl is a soccer player. David Beckham, the man, is married to a former Spice Girl. Therefore, David Beckham is a soccer player. Is this argument valid? Yes, it is. This argument expresses a conclusion that's inferred by the premises, meaning that because the premises are assumed to be true, and we're pretending that the premises are true because we're just talking about structure here, we have not gotten to the content portion. Pretending that these premises are true, we are forced to accept the conclusion. The conclusion is guaranteed if these premises are true. There is no way to deny the conclusion. We are backed into the corner of accepting this conclusion by accepting the premises. This is how all deductive arguments should be expressed. They should be expressed in a structure where, assuming the premises are true, your interlocutor is forced into believing your conclusion. That way, they cannot deny your conclusion if they assume the premises are true. And remember, when we're looking at arguments in standard form, with the premises being clear, commonsensical, commonly accepted propositions, the person that you're arguing with, your interlocutor, should not disagree with your premises. And if they do not disagree with your premises, if they accept your premises, they should be forced into accepting the conclusion. What about this argument? Is this argument valid? Yes, this argument is as valid as they come. The conclusion is guaranteed by the premises, even though each one of these propositions is pure gibberish. If the premises in black are true, then the conclusion is guaranteed. There is no way out of accepting the conclusion if the premises are true. So here, by saying that all lions understand Spanish, if in fact some penguins are lions, then those penguins must understand Spanish. This is the perfect structure for a deductive argument, even though each proposition is most likely false. And we can show this by getting rid of the predicates within this sentence and replacing them with variables. So you can see, if I were to express the same argument, but with variables, all L understands S, and some P are L, it would be clear that some P understands S. But we often get confused with the predicates. And so we need to make sure that when we're looking at an argument structure, we're seeing the scaffolding, we're seeing the building blocks of that argument, and not necessarily focusing on the content at first. First, we look at the structure, we determine whether or not the argument's valid, and then we can move on to the content. So when we think of validity, arguments are valid or invalid really in virtue of the relationship between each of the propositions. Think of a third in music. A third is a matter of a relationship between two notes. It's not necessarily a specific pitch or individual note. The validity is a matter of an argument's form or structure. So when we're looking at arguments, be aware that an argument can be valid even if all of the propositions are false, like with the first argument we looked at. Or maybe one or all of its premises are false, but its conclusion is true. It can still be valid. An argument can be invalid even if all of its propositions are true. So assuming we're telling the truth with every proposition, we can still have a bad argument. This should highlight the idea that when we're expressing arguments, it's not just true statements that we're focusing on. Just because I express all factual information doesn't mean I have a good argument. Facts are not everything. It's about how we connect those facts with one another, how we structure them within the argument that really makes sense. And so an argument cannot be valid if the premises are true and its conclusion is false. Because if the premises are true and the conclusion is false, it means the premises have not entailed the conclusion. They do not lead us to believe the conclusion. Now, of course, just because you have good structure doesn't mean that you have a good argument. It just means the structure is good. In order for an argument to be good, not only does it have to have good structure, but it also must have to have good content. And an argument that has good structure and good content is said to be a sound argument. An argument is sound if it's both valid and the premises are true. So looking back at this argument, every man married to a former Spice Girl is a soccer player. David Beckham is married to a former Spice Girl. David Beckham is a soccer player. Is this argument sound? The answer is no, it's not. Because even though this argument is valid, it has good structure, the first premise is false. Not every man married to a former Spice Girl is a soccer player. And so if the first premise is false, we do not need to accept the conclusion. Now, what about this argument? Some soccer players are married to pop stars. David Beckham is married to a pop star. Therefore, David Beckham is a soccer player. is this argument sound? The answer again is no, it is not sound. But here it's not sound because the argument is invalid. Even though each one of these propositions is true, the structure does not lead the premises to entail the conclusion, which means the structure is poor. It is an invalid argument. And any argument that is invalid is automatically rendered unsound. For a good argument, we want the structure to be there, we want validity, but we also want true premises in the conclusion. So we want validity and soundness. How about this one? All cats are mammals, Jessica is a cat, therefore Jessica is a mammal. This argument is sound. It has true premises that lead to a true conclusion, and the premises infer the conclusion. Accepting the premises requires you to accept the conclusion. So here we have a good, valid, and sound argument. Notice how, if I accept the premises, I cannot deny the conclusion. Assuming all cats are mammals, and assuming it's true that Jessica is in fact a cat, because I know that Jessica is a cat here, I must then accept that Jessica is a mammal. So when we think of sound arguments, we're thinking of really a subset of valid arguments. In other words, all sound arguments are valid, but not all valid arguments are sound. Which means you can have a valid sound argument, you can have a valid but unsound argument, if the structure is good but the content is false. You can have an invalid and unsound argument, but you can never have an invalid but sound argument. So in conclusion, good arguments, what we're trying to obtain, what we're trying to express and evaluate are arguments that are both structurally valid and sound, true premises with a true conclusion. We want structure and content, and without one or the other, the argument is not a good one. This is what we should expect, and this is what we should expect of ourselves when expressing arguments. So the next 3 slides are all exercises. So I'll tell you to pause your video, and I would like you to have a go at trying to determine whether or not these arguments are valid and sound, invalid and unsound, or valid but unsound. 3 options. Is the structure good and the content good? Is both the structure and content bad? Or is the structure good, but the content is bad? If you have a mullet, you are either very cool or very uncool. Michael has a mullet. Michael is not very cool. Therefore, Michael is very uncool. Pause your video now to try this on your own. So if you answered that this argument is valid but unsound, you are correct. The structure of this argument is good. It highlights that if you have a mullet, you are one of 2 things, either very cool or very uncool. And then it expresses the idea that Michael in fact does have a mullet. So now, Michael is very cool or uncool. I eliminate Michael not being very cool. So I'm left with the idea that Michael is very uncool. Accepting these premises guarantees me the conclusion. However, the first premise and the third premise are not necessarily true propositions. The first premise, if you have a mullet, you are either very cool or very uncool, is actually committing a fallacy that we're going to talk about later in this course, and is a fallacy of the false dichotomy. Technically, a person could have a mullet and neither be cool nor uncool. They could probably be somewhere in the middle. Perhaps they're wearing a mullet as an ironic Halloween costume. And with the third premise, we see that it's very subjective. Michael is not very cool. Perhaps his mother thinks he is very cool, though. So for it to be an objective fact that Michael is not very cool is not necessarily the case. So here we have two questionable propositions, even though if we assumed all the premises were true, the conclusion would follow. So we have a valid, structurally good argument, but the argument is not sound because the content is lacking. Let's try another. All logicians are mad. Some mad people love Beethoven. Therefore, some logicians love Beethoven. A logician is just someone who studies logic. If you'd like to figure this out on your own, please pause the video now. If you answered that this argument is invalid and therefore unsound, you are correct. The premises do not lead us to the conclusion here. All logicians are mad, but to say that some mad people love Beethoven doesn't mean that those mad people have to be within the same circle of people loving Beethoven as people who are logicians. So in fact, we might see that all logicians are mad, but the mad people that love Beethoven does not overlap with the group of logicians. Therefore, to suggest that some logicians love Beethoven is just not true. And you can do this by simply drawing circles to represent each one of these predicates. If I were to draw a circle to represent all of the mad people, and then draw a subset of that, which were all the logicians, within that mad circle. So I'd have a small circle within a larger circle, where all of the smaller circle resided in the bigger circle. All of the logicians fell within the mad people circle. And then I drew another circle, some mad people of Beethoven. It was separate from the logician circle, where some of it overlapped with the mad circle and some of it did not. So that some people who love Beethoven were in the mad circle, but also some people who love Beethoven were not in the mad circle. I could see that these two circles, those that love Beethoven and those that are logicians, don't necessarily have to touch one another. And because I can imagine that world, it means that the premises do not entail the conclusion. Because if I had a valid argument, the premises would guarantee the conclusion. I would not be able to think about an existence where this wasn't true. Remember, imagine the premises being true and think of any possible explanation or world in which your conclusion could be false. It doesn't matter if you're thinking of a world, a Star Trek world, or a Marvel Universe world, a world in which the laws of physics were different. If you can even imagine a world where the conclusion is false, then the premises do not entail the conclusion. Because if your argument is valid, the premises guarantee your conclusion. It will be logically impossible to deny that conclusion. And here we have a conclusion that we can deny. So this argument is invalid, and any argument that's invalid is also unsound. Lastly, if this glass of water is fresh and not contaminated, then it is drinkable. This glass of water is not fresh, therefore this glass of water is not drinkable. Pause your video now to work this out on your own. This argument is again invalid and therefore unsound. The reason that this argument is invalid and therefore unsound is because the first premise expresses that if this glass of water is fresh and not contaminated, then it is drinkable. Our conclusion, on the other hand, expresses the idea that the glass of water is not drinkable. The first premise gives us criteria for water that is drinkable, but just one criteria. there could be other criteria that allow for drinkable water. So we might have drinkable water that's not fresh and is contaminated, or we can have drinkable water that's not fresh and not contaminated, or we can have drinkable water that's fresh but not contaminated. In either instance, these premises don't necessarily guarantee my conclusion. And we can understand a world in which this is the case just by looking at our own world. I might think to myself that I have a glass of water on the table, and my glass of water on the table I poured last night before I went to bed. Now, if that glass of water that I poured last night is fresh and not contaminated, then it would be drinkable, no denying it. But now let's say I don't drink that glass of water until today. So this glass of water on my desk is not fresh. Well, can I still drink the water? Of course I can. So I can deny the conclusion there. Remember, pretend the premises are true and try to think of a way out of denying the conclusion. Think of a way of denying the conclusion, and if you can, the argument is invalid. And if it's invalid, it's automatically unsound.